Sure.
Yes, he does the microphone, I think.
Yeah, I think it's getting broken as well.
Yeah, but he uses the microphone.
That's why I have a wonderful, it doesn't measure He's exactly. Oh, yeah. What? Shelley had told him last night.
Okay, let me call to order the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management meeting for July 22nd. If you'll rise, a pledge of allegiance. Dr. Kelly, if you'll lead us.
Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, roll call.
Chair Mulhart?
Here.
Director Craven? Here. Director Bennett?
Here.
Director Kelly?
Here.
Director Schwabauer?
Here. Okay, Sam McIntyre is in the audience as an alternate, and looking through, I think he is the only alternate I see. Okay. Agenda review, any changes?
No changes.
Okay, public comments, opportunity for the, the public to address the GMA board on non-agenda items. Tom.
Tom Smith, City of Camarillo, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak to you today. The purpose of my being here today is just to kind of reiterate some information that I have provided to you in a letter that I wrote dated July 20. If you need a copy of that letter, I have additional copies with me today.
They're up here.
Good.
I'm not sure everybody got a chance to read them, but because it was just filed.
Well, I'll keep this really brief because the letter pretty much speaks for itself. But I just wanted to reiterate, like I said, that in January of this year we had sent in an application for the transfer of some groundwater allocation. It's actually 299.4 acre feet, and also I sent a follow-up letter in February of this year. And at your March 23, 2011 meeting, your board approved the transfer of ag to M&I groundwater transfers and gave staff direction at that point to approve those transfer requests as they were received. So today we're here and we still have not received an approval of our application for the transfer of the allocation, and with the City of Camarillo raises some concern with regard to what are the expectations for agencies when it comes to the transfer of allocations, and we would request that your board would give staff direction to approve our allocation.
Okay, what's the status? Where are we in this thing?
After the approval in March by your board, it was done with not all the primary members seated. I received 2 phone calls from 2 different board members who sat that day asking that the item be brought back for reconsideration. We plan on doing that in September.
Okay. All right. So September.
Mr. Chairman, that runs contrary to what I remember. Tell me what the heck. You watched the video and we did something wrong?
No, I got a call the next day by board members who asked that the item be reconsidered.
I have a question of the attorney. Just because somebody doesn't like if they're not here and their alternate comes, which is what is supposed to happen, and they don't like the outcome, they can call for an item to come back. I mean, that isn't the way we operate in my agency, so I'm questioning why it's happening here.
In my opinion, it was settled, done, and finished.
Well, the procedure for reconsidering a matter, I don't believe, is set out in any of this agency's procedures. So it's an open question as to how that can be done. I know, for example, the county has specific rules for its board of supervisors as to how a matter can be brought back for reconsideration. I don't believe the agency has adopted those rules, but generally speaking, you are correct that if the board acting through an alternate approves an item or makes a decision that that is the decision of the board, notwithstanding the wishes of the regular member who was not in attendance that day. So I think the general answer to your question is that the matter would be subject to reconsideration if that is the wish of this board. But with the fact that there are alternates, it raises the additional issue of can those members who were not present vote to reconsider a matter that was decided by alternates or other members of the board. So those are issues that we would need to look at before before any action were to take place on it.
A point of clarification, the calls that I got were from members who had voted that day before, not from the primary seated member.
Members who voted in the affirmatives, you mean?
And also, I would point out this particular issue, I believe, was a matter of direction by the board as to how the ordinance code should be interpreted or enforced. So that, I think, by its nature, is a matter that would allow for reconsideration based on further input and further deliberation by the board.
Okay, all right, we're kind of at a dilemma here. We have a non-agenda item, and we have a non-agenda item. Essentially, a constituent has brought a problem to us on a non-agenda item. The solution would be to agendize to deal with it in September, unless an interpretation is made is that it should have never been delayed and in fact had legal standing, I guess is the proper term, way back when, in which case are we in effect directing staff, are we making a decision here and hence in violation of some rule that the world has created for us. So you got to give me some guidance here. To me, to me, the simple solution is just to deal with it in September, unless that's not the correct solution, in which case the only correct solution is we just move forward with whatever decision the board made at the time. It's a non-agenda item. Tell me what to do.
Right, it is. So no action can be taken on it today. I think the issue you're raising is whether the city has the right to proceed with its request pursuant to the action that the board took in March, and that may be, but that's not an issue to be decided here today.
So regardless of what we do, the earliest that we can have some kind of hard direction to staff is September, is what you're telling me.
To take any action with respect to the city's request and or further or similar requests for the title transfer under that provision of the ordinance. So,
okay, Tom?
Okay. Well, my interpretation is that you're not really taking any action today. All you're doing is just carrying out what was already approved by the board back in March. I mean, you're not taking action.
Hal?
Well, no, he's asked. Well, the way I interpret it is the city is asking to have its application approved, and
No, that's wrong. The application was told to be approved.
All I'm doing is
There
bringing
were
it.
5 of us here that day seated, were there not, Jeff?
That's my recollection.
And how can a minority group cause us to reverse ourselves? And I would remind council, this is a state agency, not a county agency, so county rules probably don't have a damn thing to do with anything.
Hold on, no, let's not go there.
Well, I would agree with that, and my point about that was that the county has a procedure for reconsideration. This agency does not. So, in that sense, it's at the discretion of your board as to whether you want to reconsider a decision that was made back in March.
But we can't make that decision today.
No.
Okay.
So, as I was saying earlier, whether the city is entitled to have its application process based on the March action is an issue that doesn't need to get decided and can't be decided today. It either does or it does not. But if your board wants to reconsider the interpretation of the ordinance, that would have to come back in September, regardless of whether that impacts the city's specific request.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
I'm totally confused, but okay. Yes, ma'am.
If that is going to come back in September, I would like an item before that to discuss our process and to decide how we're going to proceed in the future, not just for that item, but if an item is to be reconsidered, the timing,
The protocol and
the
everything.
protocol, the whole thing. I think that we definitely need a policy. And I would like to discuss that before we discuss the item at hand.
Okay.
And I don't mean months ahead, I mean the item before.
I find it most interesting that staff can feel it's comfortable of deciding they just won't do what we told them to.
Okay. Dave?
Well, my comment is, I agree with what Charlotte said. I mean, to my line of thinking, if this body has made a decision and then another member of the body didn't like the decision, to me that's irrelevant. I mean, the decision had been made by the body as a group, and there was a vote taken by this group for that action. It's done. I have difficulty understanding how another board member can go to staff and then say this is not the proper vote. We need to reconsider this.
I appreciate what you're saying. I think what staff is saying is, I'm guessing it was a close vote. I don't remember. Was it a? I think maybe it was a 3-2
4 to
vote.
1.
What's that?
My recollection, it was 4 to 1.
Okay, 4 to 1. And that not somebody who voted against it went there, but somebody who voted for it is saying, hey, they now, people who voted for it said that they are changing their mind. But I would agree with you, just because they communicate that to them, until it gets changed by this board, it's board policy. And I don't know how you, I don't have any other way that you go around that. You know, it should be, at a minimum, we need to know that if somebody wants to, in other words, somebody goes to staff and says, I've changed my mind, and they were in the affirmative, then they also have to come here and say, I want to re-agendize this. Then staff could potentially, in lieu of until it gets reconsidered, staff could potentially do that, because that's part of what reconsideration is make sure you don't do something until. But I would agree with you, if that didn't happen, it didn't come to this board. I don't know how you have it.
Well, and just my read on it as well is from the Board of Supervisors, in which you were a member. I mean, there's a process that would have to be gone through if that reconsideration is to take place. And this clearly has no process.
Okay, let's see if we can, I want to make sure whatever we tell staff to do, we're on ground. We do not have a policy on how to reconsider. I agree with Charlotte. That needs to be on an agenda item as soon as possible. Dan, you want to speak? Yeah. Okay.
Can
Tom,
I say one more thing and I'll get out of your way? The last thing I just wanted to add was that the comment from your board at that time was that all future applications would be approved, not just the City of Camarillo's application.
Okay. Dan.
Thank you.
Actually, I was one of the ones that made the phone call after reviewing everything and going through all the steps again, because I didn't think we had enough prep time to really understand the whole magnitude of this. And so I was the one that brought that up, and I think it should be re-looked at, reconsidered, and actually have some lead time for the protocol to set it in place because this is an important issue. So I raised the flag saying, you know what, I voted yes, but there's a lot of caveats that it didn't really get answered correctly, in my mind, afterwards. So I just want to be on the record for that.
Okay, thanks, Dan. We can, first of all, we're effectively taking an action here, and I have concerns about that. So you tell me when we cross the line where we can't do it. But in the top of my head, we do not have a protocol for raising a flag. We need to have that protocol. And Charlotte, I think, is correct, and I think we all agree we need to get something in so there's a methodology. When people make a decision, they have a chance to think about it. Second of all, if in fact we don't have that protocol and the board as a group passed an agenda item, do we have the authority to say, staff, get on with it and get that item done? Or is that making a decision? Or do we basically say, put this on the agenda for September and let's sort it out again? Tell us what normally when we hear public comments, they're not agenda items. We hear the public and we direct staff to do A, B, and C. This one here is more complicated than that. Tell me what you're going to allow us to do.
Could I just ask one thing before County Council weighs in and answers your question? And number one, I want to clarify, this gentleman says that he believes the direction was to approve all future ones, not Camarillo. My question for staff is that how staff heard the motion?
What does the tape say?
Yeah, I'll go back to the tape to make sure I answer that question.
Okay.
But that's my recollection.
Because I know you appreciate hearing what County Council has to say, but I think all five of us have said unless the board changes its position, the board's position stands. I think the only question is what was the board's position by listening to that tape. But be that as it may, I'd be happy to.
The reason I'm raising the question is if we hear from the public and we direct staff to implement what they approve, are we taking action today? If that's not considered action, then we can do that. If that's considered action, then, because you just said we can't take any action until September. So that's the clarification I want.
No, the action that your board took occurred in March, whatever that is, and that's a matter of record. If staff is having some trouble interpreting it, that's a matter that they need to bring back to your board. I think your board cannot and need not take any action with respect to the specific application that the city is raising here today. What the board did in March, it did. And that may come back for reconsideration in September. It may not. But that's a matter of record. As Jeff indicated, he can go back and review what the specific action was, since there seems to be some question about that. But your board doesn't need to do anything today in furtherance of that approval or that decision that was made back in March, and under the Brown Act can't do anything. It would be the equivalent of a reconsideration that ends up with an affirmance of what was decided back in March, which is not on the agenda.
Mr. Chairman,
that may be agendized for September.
The issue that the city of Camarillo had that day were specific to some old wells that had been used a long time ago. And staff was giving the impression of nitpicking the deal that they couldn't find the old records. Obviously, the properties were being farmed, therefore they had to have used some water. And so the position the city of Camarillo was asking for seemed quite legitimate. Whether or not the words for here and hereafter got in there, I don't remember that portion of it. But the issues that the city of Camarillo brought were very specific with regard to specific properties. Not that I enjoy seeing 1 acre turned into houses in this place. It would be better if we bulldozed a few houses down. But in order to do that conversion, they were asking for the credit of the old wells. And I don't see how, like in our world, I don't know how somebody could find my old records out of the Canal Valley with the wells.
I'm not arguing for or against the city of Camarillo's application. I'm arguing a procedural process. And the procedural process, the vote acted as a board in March. We're being asked by a constituent to reaffirm effectively that vote by telling staff to do something. If that's in a violation of the Brown Act, we can't do it. If, on the other hand, we say to staff, you've heard this discussion, sit down with the applicant and solve this problem, and if it isn't solved, it needs to be on the September agenda, and before we put that item on the agenda, I want something in front of that item that tells us what our protocol is for dealing with this issue. And if you can get this problem solved with the applicant between now and September, that item doesn't have to be on the agenda, but the protocol has to be on the agenda. I can do that.
Well, the larger item on whether or not it's just that the issue at hand was could you show no net detriment? And
well, I think all right. Let me interrupt you so we don't eat up the whole day on this one. Al opened the door by saying, if staff has problems interpreting what the board's direction is, and that's the criteria by which you want to put it on the agenda for September, then do that. But before it gets on the September agenda, if you can solve the problem, solve it. If you can't solve it, put something in front of it regardless that tells us what's the protocol when a member has second thoughts, either because they have second thoughts or they get more information saying, had I known that, I wouldn't have voted that way. Some protocol, I don't know what it is, but there's examples out there. Let's get that on the agenda and we can put it into our system.
Either way.
Either way. Everybody okay with that?
The point of clarification I was trying to make was even if we do solve the isolated program in Camera, you probably still want the second, but there's still maybe 2 items to hear.
Okay.
Call item and then the reaffirmation of blanket.
Okay, however you want to put it on, that's fine with me. Okay, Tom, that's what we're going to do, because I can't make decisions of the way we're constituted. But I think I'm hearing nods from everybody. You're okay with that staff direction? Okay, Al, you okay with that? All right. So much for an hour and 20-minute meeting. Yeah, I know. I said that when I walked in. She did it in an hour and 10 minutes, and then you guys beat up on me all the time for not running fast meetings. This is what Gene Perella did to me when he
And I
forced me
believe
onto
you
the
weren't
board.
at the March meeting, and it was shorter than this, too.
I understand that. All right. Let me try this one more time. Public comments. By the way, Dan Nauman is in the audience as an alternate. Let me try this one more time. Yeah. All right. Public comments. Anybody have any comments for the board not on the agenda? If Rob Saberstein comes up, we're going to adjourn. I tell him. All right.
We're going to talk about national debt.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, Obamacare. I appreciate it. Sam, anything you want to talk about? Oh, Sam's shaking his head. All right, folks, we're moving off this public comment because we spent more than 6 minutes on it. My God. If Dave Schwabauer wasn't here, we'd be moving along. Dave's done it all to us. Guess what? Board member comments. All right, consent items. We have approval of minutes, a motion to approve.
Move the approval.
Second. I wasn't here, but I read through the minutes. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, hearing none. Informational item. Brian, hello there.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Item 2 is our monthly update on the Las Posas Basin planning process. In June, the users group did not meet. We elected to take some time and start putting pen to paper. Before you should have a copy of the work product that's been produced to date. It's a couple sections of the plan. What we did today at the users group meeting was go through the table of contents and make sure that everybody was comfortable with how we've laid out this management plan. Basically, real quickly, there are 5 sections. An introduction that basically lays out the background and purpose for the plan, the area that the plan covers. The second section describes the institutional setting, describes the GMA, the SALT's TMDL, and other jurisdictional interests. The third section will discuss the basin conditions, so land use, surface water, groundwater, the aquifers, and most importantly, the yield of those different aquifers in the different areas that we're trying to manage. Today, the group considered draft text for sections 1 and 3. Those sections were well received. We had a number of constructive comments. Overall, we think we're on mark based on what we heard today, and we'll be moving forward with providing the group sections 2 and 4 at the next users group meeting, which will be 2 weeks from today. We've resumed meeting twice monthly to accelerate the process of writing the plan and reviewing it. I laid out a schedule for the group to consider sections of the plan as we are able to produce them, and so over the next 2 months we hope to be in a position of having the group approve a plan. Now there's still a lot of material to go through, and that's subject to obviously some delays. If they come up, I will keep your board informed of the schedule and pace, but we're still pushing very, very hard to stay in line with the schedule I provided you way back in January. And unless there's any questions, that concludes my update.
Okay. Anybody have any questions for Brian? You were at the, both of you, I assume, were at the user group meeting. How'd that go? Or everything's fine?
Yeah, I just want to commend Brian for the work that he's done. What we saw presented to us today was probably the most in-depth written material that I've seen on the basin, and it was very impressive to see it put down in paper. Historical perspective, I feel, is extremely important, and Brian went way back in the state studies, bringing material together. Maps are very good, and talking about all of the various implications and how they affect us is extremely important. I would just like to say that the attendance at today's meeting was one of the highest that I recall. The dialogue was extremely intense. There was a lot of give and take on a lot of the issues, and the members that were there were really digging their teeth in, so to speak. It was a good meeting. Thank you to Callegas, too, for their help in hosting this. Henry Susan, we really thank you, because having a forum like you provide for us is something that is extremely important. Thank you.
Okay. Jim?
Yeah, I would concur on all the comments. The one thing would be, if there's anyone here who's a stakeholder in the Las Posas who isn't coming to the meetings, you need to start coming to the meetings, because we're rolling right on down the road. And we would not like to have a speed bump, of a dead body laying in front of us here in a few weeks. So, if you've got anything you want to address, do it sooner rather than later, because we're trying. The committee in Las Posas seems to be trying to comply with this board's instructions to get on with it, because we can't keep delaying it, as county council has told us. So a very honest effort, Mr. Chairman, is being done to get done with it.
Good. From my standpoint, this model, I think when you finally get it done, we can replicate in some of the other areas that we're dealing with, and you're obviously involved in those areas too. So you guys are blazing the trail, so good work. All right, anybody else?
Can I just add that if there's anybody out there who wants a copy of this, they can contact me. I have a few extras with me today. If we run out, I can get more.
Okay. Susan, did you have a comment?
I echo what's been said before. I think the supplement that I would add is that the group's able to ask tough questions and raise issues of controversy and talk about them in a non-defensive, honest way. And we've got a lot of tough issues ahead, but so far we've already talked about some of them and aired and discussed some of our differences already, and it continues to go well. So good. That's promising for the rest of the process. And I commend Brian for being a mediator, and when he is asked a tough question, he's never defensive. He just gives reasons and explains things, and that helps set the tone for the group.
Susan, before you leave, Mike just reminded me, because we're on tape, you got to give us your name.
I'm sorry. Susan Mulligan, Callegas Municipal Water District.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert, did you want to speak?
Robert Ronio, Crestview Mutual Water Company. I also would like to echo what has been said already about this. Brian has done a fantastic job so far and has been a very good read of this. And Henry, with his hours that he's put into it, has been instrumental in making this whole process move forward. Lastly, given the sections that Dr. Steve is going to be contributing to this, I think he's got his work cut out for him in order to be able to keep up with the young guys.
Oh, the marker's been set. Good. And there were no attorneys in the room. Maybe that's why there was no fighting. Huh?
Of course, Steve's not here to defend himself.
All right, very good. Thanks, guys.
Actually, we did have the council in the room, private, but didn't slow anything down.
Oh, good. Well, that's interesting. All right, let's receive and file. Motion to receive and file.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
And opposed? Hearing none. Okay, let's go to number 3.
Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Rick Virgutz. I'll be presenting item number 3 today, Local Groundwater Assistance Program Grant for Automatic Meter Reading Equipment. I have a sort of a lengthy presentation, but I'll try and go through it quickly. And but if anything comes up, please feel free to ask, while I'm going through the slides, or we can pick it up at the end. Okay. So in October, the decision was made, October 2007, the agency made the decision to apply for the Local Groundwater Assistance Program grant. In December of 2007, we adopted a resolution to do so. and we moved forward with it. At that time, the objectives were to provide telemetry equipment, to reduce stakeholder burden, modernize the agency billing practices, reduce costs, increase reporting accuracy, and provide real-time groundwater extraction data. There are other things not on this slide, though, that probably bears some mentioning. That in the big picture, this is a pilot project. We want to learn how well this system works. We want to learn if it has applicability for the agency. Also, the state of California, the granting agency, wants to make sure that this money is used to help manage the aquifer. They're not as interested in our billing and internal efficiencies as we are. They want to make sure that this helps with aquifer management. So I just wanted to put that out there. In 2009, we were notified the grant was awarded but not funded, so there was a delay. Money became available in July 2010. Your board reaffirmed moving forward with the contract agreement at that time. We executed the agreement in August 2010. We had some difficulties, though, as you may recall. We faced two problems. The vendor that we'd been dealing with that had literally just confirmed its costs failed to bid. They fell off the radar, if you will. And we also had an issue with the Ventura Regional Groundwater Flow Model. It was around that time that we learned that there were some issues with that model, that it needed some work, and United didn't feel that the model was the appropriate, or that it was appropriate to use the model for to receive automatic meter reading data. So some time had passed since 2007. That brought us up to February 2011, and we proposed a revised approach to your board to handle these issues. Your board felt the revised approach was too much of a shift from what was envisioned, and you directed us to investigate and report back on a number of issues. And so that's one of the reasons we're here today. So we're here to report back. I've got a number of slides going through responses to board member questions, and then some more detail on costs and benefits, and very briefly some information on the applicability of the County Waterworks District automatic meter reading program. So what I'd like to do, there were 13 questions posed by the board. They're described in the staff report in some detail. What I'd like to do is just go through them sort of quickly.
As for the sake of time, rather than going through each of them, let me ask, first of all, any board members have any questions on, because you go through, they responded to each of these questions. Anybody have any specific item they want to talk about? Okay, before you.
This list of questions appear to be identical, are they not, Mr. Vergoose, from what we saw back in previous times we reviewed this? I'm not finding any alterations in the answers.
Right, the questions are the same.
Okay. Anybody in the audience have any specific questions on any of the 13 items that staff reviewed? Okay. All right. Just to save some time here, so let's move on to the next. We'll assume that, and if along the way, if somebody goes and says, yes, it just reminds me I had a question on item 5 or whatever, just sing out, we'll deal with it then, okay?
Okay, moving on out of that section on questions, I have a slide called Background Cost Analysis. Since February, we had talked with Macrometer some more, and by the way, representatives of Macrometer are here today. They're in the back there. The per unit cost proposal is lower than what we provided to your board in February. The current proposed contract revision would include 20 automatic meter reading units with a water level, water quality, or soil moisture sensor, and 121 without a sensor. So the total equipment cost is $249,914 for these pilot project units. Getting back to the contract, so our proposed contract revision would include $220,880,000 for state grant funds, $29,600 of GMA in-kind funds. Total proposed expenditures for equipment would be $250,480. The contract revision also includes money for administration. It includes both grant money and agency matching money. $24,000 of state grant funds for quarterly and final reports, and $21,000, 280, forgive me, I'm rounding as I go here, $21,280 of in-kind funds for administration, and the total proposed expenditures would be $45,280. Okay, recurring costs. We had a number of questions about recurring costs. They weren't expected. They were higher than what we thought. We've dug into that a little bit more. The current proposal includes the following: annual maintenance once every 3 years for the AMR units. Initially it was once a year. We've gone to once every 3 years. That comes down to about $66 per unit per year. Data monitoring for 141 units is an average of $87.40 or $87 per year. And repairs within 5 years, we're budgeting $80 per unit per year over a 5-year period.
Let me ask you about these. Does those per unit cost include the time and labor of physically getting there, or that's just the materials on the unit itself? What does that unit cost include?
The cost includes a 30-minute visit at the site for the maintenance, and I'm pretty sure it includes the cost too, but let me just defer to Micrometer. They're nodding, so that would include travel time.
Okay.
So the annual recurring cost for the units would be about $189 per unit per year. And I'll show you this figure again a little bit later. Initial information. We also evaluated the cost of the current paper system. That was one of the questions, and it's a good question. And let me explain to you how we did that evaluation. First of all, agency staff keys in extraction data for 775 wells twice a year. And we estimate that it takes 743 hours to do that. Where we spend a lot of time, well, let me back up a little bit. You know, when we receive the semi-annual extraction statements from people, they typically come in 3 categories. Satisfactory, which covers about 50% of the wells. A category we refer to as some mistakes, which covers about 30% of the wells, and significant errors in reporting, which covers about 20% of the wells. As far as the satisfactory reporting, these go pretty quick when Sheila inputs the data into the computer. Some mistakes takes about twice the amount of time. We've estimated about 0.7 hours per year, or that would be 0.35 hours per 6-month period. And then the significant errors category, this can take an hour and a half per semi-annual event, or 3 hours a year for this 20%. And here's a pie chart just describing that. So reporting correctness of the 775 metered wells, about 50% is satisfactory, about 30% have some mistakes, and about 20% takes a lot of time. And I'm not talking about detailed enforcement. I'm talking about what we would call very light enforcement, maybe a couple phone calls, maybe chasing down the right person to answer the questions. But it takes time. So we looked at the data entry costs for the extraction data. The proportion of staff time to enter the data is about 15% of staff time for the satisfactory data, 22% of staff time for the some mistakes category, and 63% for the semi-annual statements that have the significant errors. This value we projected over $40,000 a year. And the key thing here
is that for all 3 or just for category C?
Just for category C. So it's the 20% of the wells that take most of the staff time in the agency, and that's due to errors in the self-reporting. And just another pie chart. You can see that most of our time is spent with the erroneous semi-annual extraction statements. It's the biggest time sink. And again, this mostly includes Sheila's time. This doesn't include any detailed enforcement. So you've probably already come to the same conclusion I did, that to really maximize the cost benefit of this AMR approach, the agency would want to install the AMR units on the wells operated in the significant reporting error category. But unfortunately, that isn't feasible. It's a voluntary program. The AMR pilot project is voluntary. Well operators who routinely provide erroneous data may not volunteer to have these systems installed. Sheila and I have had a few discussions on it. She has a lot of history here with the agency. She understands that some of the operators are typically providing information that isn't good, but there's another issue, which is some operators just randomly provide data that isn't correct, and it takes a lot of staff time to chase down. So what we've done is, because the participation in the pilot project would be voluntary, we've basically scaled the installation of these automatic meter reading units across all three categories. So what we've proposed for our cost analysis is that 70 would be installed for those wells that cover the satisfactory category, 42 in the some mistakes category, and 29 in the significant errors category. And so the staff time savings for data entry and very light enforcement would be approximately $13,000 per year under this approach. It does not include enforcement. Many of us assumed early on, at one point or another, that the purpose of this pilot project was to catch scofflaws and do things of that nature. But going over it and looking at it, a voluntary program isn't going to be able to do that. And I don't think it was ever really envisioned to catch scofflaws. A little bit more on cost. So staff time savings is about 50% of the annual carrying cost of the 141 AMR units. If we add in costs for detailed enforcement and legal work, the cost savings would be higher. The staff report has a little discussion on this. We estimate those combined costs to be about $125,000 per year on the low end, at $50,000 a year for enforcement work. This is the figure that I showed you earlier. Whoops. This would be the carrying cost per automatic meter reading unit. When we look at the cost per well within the GMA right now, we've got an average cost of about $96 per meter per year without the enforcement, and depending on how much money the agency spends a year, roughly $160 to $194 per well per year. So you can see that they're in the ballpark, which I thought was important to point out. Our thinking is that, for the pilot project, we're comfortable that we could recover about 50% of the carrying costs. If we found through the pilot project, and we're talking years down the line, that it did work for the agency, we could probably recover a lot more of the carrying costs because we'd be able to cut down on the dollars we spend on enforcement. And I think that's an important point to make. Okay, benefits. We have both direct and indirect benefits with this project. Number one, ability to better understand and communicate demands on the groundwater resource. This is a pilot project. It's about the groundwater resource and better understanding it, and it also will help reduce stakeholder burden and improve efficiencies within the agency. It's an opportunity to use technology to better manage the aquifer. Increased data accuracy is increased credibility for the agency. I don't know how many times we've been asked the question, do we really have a good handle on whether or not the reporting is correct or not? We operate in a realm in the agency where we don't know for sure how good the reporting is. We think a lot of it is good, but we don't know for sure. It'll help us determine the best use for future applications of the technology, and the pilot test, importantly, will prove or disprove that the technology will help with groundwater management here. We've got other benefits that are what I've labeled as indirect. The first one is a potential big direct benefit, though, but what it is developing our relationship with DWR as a grantee. It would provide us better standing in the future, and that has a big potential direct benefit to the agency. If the pilot test works well, we anticipate that we might want to install more of these in the future. If it does work well, we think it'll incentivize lower costs for equipment. Another one that I've thought of recently after talking with some stakeholders is that the data can potentially be used to show that agricultural water use is sensitive to weather and precipitation in a way that we can't show now. That gets to agricultural water efficiency, which is something, as you know, the state of California is very interested in. A little bit on the county waterworks system. After we met and talked with your board in February, I went out and met with Reddy Pacala's staff at the county waterworks district to look at their automatic meter reading system. They use census meters. It's a drive-by system. And at the time, I was hoping that that would be a real good option for the agency as opposed to what we'd been looking at. I'd hoped it would be less costly. But after spending some time with them and looking at how they do it and looking what it costs, it doesn't pan out. As a matter of fact, their drive-by system will only work on census meters. And even for existing census meters, they have to spend between $400 and $500 to retrofit them with a pulse output and radio unit. And it's a very highly specialized system. It works great for them. It's very accurate, but it's so specialized and so specific to those meters that it doesn't have a good applicability to the GMA. So, conclusion, we've worked to address board member questions. For the pilot test, we think at least 50% of the annual recurring costs can be made up by staff time savings. Full scale, if the agency were to move forward with the full scale project, and that's a big if, this is a pilot project, but our current projection is that if we could do it full scale, we could cover about 100% of the annual recurring costs with staff time savings. It's also a communication and credibility tool for the agency. It would be wonderful for the agency to really hit the nail on the head when it gets questions about how well it understands the pumping volumes in the agency and other factors. And establishing a grantee relationship with DWR may really position the Fox Canyon GMA in a good place to get grants in the future. And these are in your staff report, but essentially we've got a couple options here. If your board desires to move forward with the pilot project, we will contact DWR. We will ask for a 9 to 12 month extension. We will revise the contract and bring it back to your board for approval. The fiscal year 11-12 budget would need to be modified to include an expenditure plan. That's attached as item 3A, and that's a proposed expenditure plan. We would send postcard invitations to the well owners who report using meters. And we'll describe the project in that. We would expect to describe that the agency would maintain the meters for a period. The staff report lists 5 years. We would describe that they would be the owners of the equipment. But there are other details that would need to be worked out. But that's our near-term game plan if your board desires to move forward with it.
Okay. Let me, I'm sorry.
Okay. If you desire not to move forward with it, you should direct us to send a letter to DWR asking that the contract be canceled.
Okay. All right. Anything else on? All right.
Nope.
Mike.
I was working with the number 700, and that's wrong, obviously. We have 700 and how many total meters you said? Seven?
We have 775.
Thank you.
And roughly about 620 of those are ag or M&I. The remainder are domestic. That's what Sheila's telling me, and it looks like a good number.
Okay, what else? Mike?
Well, the reason I was asking how many meters, I was working on a number 700 because that's about 775. The only way you're going to be able to analyze everybody is make it 100%. So I think all the numbers that you project should be off of that, because everything else is temporary. And when I run the numbers, you know, I come up with about $30,000 a year on the 700 that's unrecovered, not counting capital costs. So, you know, Mr. Chairman, I think Gerard deleted this from our budget that we passed last month. Is that not true? We accepted the budget last month. Correct. And this was deleted from the, so we'll have to add this back in our crusade to try to save some money. It was taken out by Gerard. And secondly is, I think as an ongoing thing, this still doesn't prove to me that we're going to break even on it. So I think in light of the money thing, I think we need to study it more, or else forget it, one or the other.
Well, all right, let me go. Dave?
Yeah, I would concur with Director Kelly. I'm not convinced of the whole project myself. One, from the dollars and cents aspect of it, and I mean, if you're going after the scofflaws, I mean, the only way you're going to do that is 100%, and then you're talking some really big money, in my opinion. I think there are a lot of other ways that that money could be spent that would be really beneficial to the pumpers besides this.
Steve?
Well, we've had this conversation a couple of times. I'd just like to review a few points that were made. In 2007, we said let's go forward with this. So the argument that, you know, if you want to go after the scofflaws, you have to do it 100%. I think everybody would agree with that. The scofflaws are not going to be the ones that volunteer for doing this. But at the same time, if you have an opportunity for somebody to give you a grant to do a pilot so that you know how to do a full implementation, that seems like a very cost-effective way to get there, is to at least have a voluntary program. Nobody's having this forced on them. It's a voluntary program to see if people would volunteer and we could learn something. Fundamental question, I think, and when it was raised this way, I think that's when this board decided to go that way. Is one of the most precious assets in Ventura County is the water in the Fox Canyon Aquifer. And that will get more precious, and things will become much more intense about water in the Fox Canyon Aquifer in the future. And there's just no question that the system will need to have confidence in the reporting of the extractions as the question of extractions become more and more critical. You know, we don't get to self-report the water we use in our homes. Your electricity meter, you don't self-report that, and this is so I don't know how ultimately one of the most precious resources in Ventura County needs to be monitored somehow. I don't know, and this seems like a very rational, cost-effective way to step forward. Is it completely cost-free? No, but I think we saw, number one, we're getting a grant for this first implementation. If we can demonstrate that it looks good, we may be able to get grants for the other implementation. And we have seen the data that suggests that it could be full cost recovery in terms of the amount of time that is out there. So I would certainly speak to us not canceling this at this point in time without reconsidering that whole issue of, you know, there may be other things we can spend the money on. I don't think that there's other ways that we can monitor in the long run with confidence this precious resource. And I need to hear what the alternative is for how we're going to do something, because the incentive for some people to not report accurately will go up as the resource becomes more precious. Thank you.
Charlotte?
I agree pretty much with what Steve says. I think that we should move forward with the test, know and find out what it shows, find out what happens, find out what it really costs. Rick's projections are projections, and we'll find out if those are true or if it's different. But I think we should move forward with the grant and get a report at the end of the grant period, or the 3 years, and actually we should get a report more often than that, and find out whether, and then have a big discussion and decide if we want to move forward.
If I could, just two other thoughts, if you don't mind me going on. And one is, I think one of the things we should ask ourselves is, to the public out there, just the general public, as we deal with the issue of seawater intrusion and what the consequences would be for this county if as a result of overdraft we have long-term problems. If we said to the average citizen, should we just have voluntary reporting? I think the average citizen would say, if you have another way where you can do that you should do that. This is a resource that's shared underground by all kinds of people. My question I have for you is, what do you have in mind if we don't do this? Director Schalbauer, is there some other way of getting something that we have real confidence in terms of the reporting?
Well, the way I would look at it is the amount of outreach that this agency has worked on with regards to getting to the pumpers and with regards to, reaching out to get the numbers that are appropriate. I think this agency has worked very hard on that. But in my perspective, what I look at when I look at take an example, when I look at the outreach that's going on right now with regards to the Las Cosas pumpers and the amount of effort that is going into that, taking money to be getting hard numbers or studies with regards to where that water is actually going underground. If we could do that, we were talking about that this morning in our group, and Brian has worked very hard on this, trying to quantify things, and he can only go so far. In my opinion, I would much rather spend that money to help determining where the water is really going underneath the ground. I understand where you're coming from a standpoint of the meter situation, but from from my perspective, to me that's not the bigger issue. To me, the bigger issue is what's going on with regards to the basins and how we're going to manage those. And to me, basin management is really key. That's my opinion.
Mike? To do the additional 634 meters on the regular meters, the number, and maybe my chronometers reps can tell me if I'm way off, I thought it was around $1,634 a unit. Is that okay? That figures out to be $1,035,956 that we would get to spend on the next leg of this project. At $4 an acre feet, do we have to find 258,989 feet of unpaid for water in order to recapture our capital costs? And when I run the maintenance at 600, I had it at $66.40. It's actually $66.38 per unit. That's running around $56,000 plus a year for the maintenance. Monitoring is $58,800 a year for monitoring rather. So that roughly comes up, and that was based on the 700, not the new number 775, of $114,800 a year that we're going to pay in monitoring maintenance costs, all of which we're projecting we're going to recover on new PWAC hours that we're not going to be spending. So if our savings are $75,000 plus 100 hours more, that's $85,000 of PWAC savings, and our cost is $114,800. So that's annually we'd have $29,800 of unrecovered costs on this PWAC hour saved, not counting any recovery of the capital costs. So the second thing I would say, we have a number of members in the ag community now who are running these multi-channel things. I don't know one yet that has a micrometer unit. Maybe they're tremendously more stable, but they're not easy to keep regulated and stuff. And so every feedback I've gotten from the ag users who are actually using them, Craig Underwood, you're familiar with Craig, he's got one. The Grether Farming has, I think, 5. Do you have one yet?
No.
They're not being that easy to maintain, and that would be the tricky unit, though, the better one. The straight one that's just going to measure the water does not have that much maintenance, more probably. But I was counting mostly just all the less expensive one, not the fancy one, thinking that ultimately that's the one we would want to use. And the $1,035,000 is just putting the inexpensive units in, not the expensive units. And I don't think this agency has $1 million capital expenditure possibility. And if we got the state, if Jerry Brown, you know, and he's been marvelous on the water things. You know, you say sometimes, watch out what you wish for. I wish Jerry Brown would be good, and by gosh darn it, he is. It's been great. But I don't know that you're going to see $1 million grant to this agency from Jerry Brown.
I mean, the beauty of this is supposed to be a debate, and so I appreciate it. A few things I would point out. Number one, because you talk about there could be some substantial cost of $1 million, et cetera. To me, that speaks to go with the experiment. Find out what it works. Find out. We have a grant for the capital cost to install these. All the more reason to go for it. We're never going to do this if we turn this grant back. It's going to be, you will be permanently sick, because you'll make the argument, where are we going to come up with the $225,000 for the first implementation? So for a pretty small cost on our part, we can learn a great deal, number one. Number two, you talk about $1 million. What is the dollar value of all the water in the Fox Canyon Aquifer right now? I don't know what it is, but it's very valuable. And if somebody went to a bank and said, there's $1 billion in the bank, and are we going to spend $1 million to make sure we can accurately keep track of the outflow of that money? I think you would. And if somebody said, well, I'd like to spend $1 million instead on keeping track of how the money moves around in the vault, at some point in time, you would say, well, why would you do that if you're not keeping something that you really have great confidence in the long run? To monitor on the outflow also. So I would take I appreciate you bringing those up, but that's all the more reason, I think, to not turn a grant down to find out. We may use this grant, we may say, we have all kinds of problems with these meters and doing this. On the other hand, what we might find is these things are starting to become more used around the state, and as they are, we may be part of that experiment and say, the costs are going down. There's new ways to do this. There's better ways to do this. But if you don't play in this, we don't participate in this experiment, we turn this grant back, we're setting ourselves back, I think, potentially a decade or longer in terms of some kind of accurate monitoring of a very precious resource in Ventura counties. Appreciate the comment.
My sense right now is, I think I told you when I first came in, we probably have to do some more studying on it, but I don't know, if people want to vote on it, we may reach that point. My sense right now is that I think we're going to face a major crossroads at the GMA, or later we're going to have this discussion on credits, and we've heard from constituents it's not a credit problem, it's an allocation problem. And I think we're going to have to, at some point, make a focus on the issue of allocation. When you start dealing with allocation, then I think the issue of fairness and accuracy, and you just cut my allocations are not going to go up, they're going to go down to some extent. And are people playing by the rules because the resource is precious? And so, to avoid a run on the bank, using your analogy, we need to make sure that we can keep track of what's coming and going out of the inventory that we have. I understand from Jeff and from Mike has said that there's other water agencies in the state that are beginning to do this kind of program because they're facing the same dilemma. It's a limited resource. We have no idea what the folks in the Delta are going to do. That affects Kiegas and everybody else on their deliveries. We don't know what the environmental issues are going to be. What we have here in the county, we need to monitor and control and make sure we give a good accounting for, because in time, I believe, if we go down the road of adjusting allocation, it's going to make that resource even more valuable. If you came in to me today and said the GMA needs to allocate $350,000 of its money to go out and do a study, I think the room would be filled with people going, what in the world are you talking about? I think that's a non-starter. I also think $1 million off the top is $1 million. So I don't know if we'll ever get to the $1 million because I don't know if the protocol will work. And I think Steve and Charlotte are right that the state has spent money to invest in water management systems or water quality or accounting for water, and that's why we were awarded a grant. And because it is a pilot program, I reserve the right to say, I'm not spending $1 million down the road, but I want to know if the system works or not. And it's voluntary, whether people do. And I've said before, I'll be the first pumper to put a unit on my well, so I'm not fighting that issue. What's that? Do you cheat? No. But every time, there are times that Sheila has sent back and said, your numbers are wrong, I added wrong. So I'm in that middle category. I don't know why. I thought my adding machine is as good as her adding machine, but apparently it's not. So anyway.
It's all in the fingers.
It's all in the fingers, and it's always my name. So none of my brothers will take credit for it. I do it. I think that, and the message that keeps coming back to me, both from staff and from the presentation, from what you members have said, it is a pilot project. It is not a foregone conclusion that we're going to do this across the board. And I'm not sure that the staff's assumptions are correct. I think you're right, Mike. And the answer is, we don't know. And the only way we will know is if we do a pilot program and limit our costs down to a point where it's manageable, and I think it is manageable at a pilot program level, see if the system works. If it does work, then we have choices to make. I think it's going to take a year to a year and a half, at least. We got to go through the grant process for a year. Then we got to put the program in place. It's going to take time to collect the data, do all those things. That pushes us 3 years down the road. Folks, if we haven't addressed the allocation issue and the other issues that are in front of us today, this whole pilot project will just go by the wayside because it'll be a bigger problem. We have to address the allocation issue. I believe in that discussion, somebody's going to raise the flag. I'll raise the flag. Is our accounting correct? Is our knowledge of how much is there correct? And if we don't know how much is in the bank and how much is coming and going from the bank, then you can always suspect that the bank is not where it's supposed to be, and hence the rules that we're going to have to put in place aren't valid. So I would argue that as we did in 07 when we applied for the grant, as we did in 09 and when we changed the grant, as we are here today, we're at a crossroad, and the crossroad is, do we invest grant money that was allocated for this purpose to test a theory, test in fact will it reach the target numbers that we have, give us the right at some future date to say we never met those target numbers, hence the staff's analysis is wrong and we're not going forward, or we met those target numbers and we got to figure out a way to come up with additional money, and that is a vote that folks will have to make at that point in time. So my only concern with part of your argument is we've already gone to the foregone conclusion that we are going to spend $1 million, and I'm not there. I haven't agreed to do that.
Mr. Chairman, one of the things that I've been wishing for or looking at, and not from a standpoint of water savings, but came to my great surprise that the public health in this county does not inspect wellheads. You know, when I was a food inspector, I had the money, I had the federal money in my pocket, that's how I controlled it. But here, we have nobody checking wellheads. We're fertigation, pumping, on my own property. I have 2 wells that Carol has. All the farmers around there, we have check valves. Do you know that every wellhead has a check valve? There's so much about wells we don't know, I think it would amaze you. If we were to take grade 1 tech, put them in a pickup truck, they could do every meter in the company doing 3 a day per year. They could examine meter heads, they could examine the well, they could see for compliance with Henry Gonzalez's requirements. There's all sorts of things we could be looking at. Rick's not going to do that sitting at his desk reading these automatic feeds. And I think that to even project forward a $1 million outlay in order to automate it, that you can replace it with one person in a pickup truck reading the meters that are there and verifying that they're functional. it just doesn't pencil out.
And the question that I would submit to you is, do we make the decision not to go all the way to the end and not even do the pilot program? And my argument, I think the argument I've heard from others, is it's worth doing the pilot program so we learn something here, and maybe out of that pilot program a lot of these unknowns will be answered. And that's kind of where I am. And
well, but there's a lot of private people who are doing this thing. The other thing I've understood was that the progress is very fast, and we may well find in 5 years that this cost goes down significantly from the $1,600 a location, and we might find that it's going to be much cheaper. I mean, how long ago were we even able to have these multi-channel units? So I don't disagree that you can always learn by doing something. Where I do have a problem, though, and this is an underlying philosophy, is that I think of the Taxpayers Association of Ventura County finds out that we spent $250,000 to experiment on something that we probably think won't work, or at least I think will not work. I think that the reporter for the Star will have a fun day with it.
I certainly have a different view, particularly when you said in 5 years these costs could be way down. That to me speaks to do the experiment, so we know. In 5 years these costs come down. We're still going to have a question of, do we want to incur those costs, or can we get a grant for those costs? And I think given the water crisis that could easily be upon the state at that point in time, it may be very easy to get a grant for installation of these wells. But we will make a far more informed decision if we take money that's been granted to us that will go to some other agency to do this kind of work. If we take that money, we'll be in far better shape by supplementing that with a little bit of our money and learning an awful lot over the course of a 3 or 4 year period of time, so that in 5 years, as you say, if these costs come way down, we'll make a much more informed decision. I find it hard to imagine that we would turn a grant back that we started all the way in 2007 trying to ascertain. You talk about waste of staff money. I think you could also have a field day with that. How much staff time has gone in to getting us here based on this board's direction for us to now at the last minute say, hey, we want to give the money back and we don't want to go.
When this grant was first talked about, it was going to be enough money to cover the whole agency because the unit was going to be significantly cheaper. I think, Rick, when we first turned it in?
Well, I seem to remember numbers around 300 or 400, depending on the cost of the telemetry and the radio systems that would need to be installed.
Listen, there is no doubt that the original vision of what we had proposed has changed. The cost of unit has changed. The cost of maintenance has changed. We have learned a whole bunch of things just by the very fact that we've debated it. And that's part of what a business person does. They come up with some grand scheme idea and pick a piece of machinery and say, the machinery do the job, and then when they find out, my gosh, you got to grease it and oil it and change it, and well, that changes everything. This is a piece of machinery. It is a tool. I view it as a tool. Is it a necessary tool? Would I be in a position today to allocate all our money to go out and test this tool? The answer is no. Given the fact that the state is giving us an incentive to help test this tool, I'm more inclined to say yes. Ultimately, do we need a tool like this? That's still a debate. But first of all, I don't know if in fact the staff projections will work that take us in the future. I see the future as having adjustment and allocation. I see that the threat against the background water that we have, the aquifers that we have, is going to continue to be threatened more, not less, from a whole bunch of external factors. And if we don't know what's going in and out to a better degree, I think we leave ourselves open for debate the whole time. So how do we start closing some of these hoops? A state grant is one of the ways to do it. Now, if you have additional questions that we need to look at, or if the strategy is, let's not spend this money and wait to see what the marketplace does in 5 years, to see if the market, in fact, responds by a less expensive item. Again, we're still gambling on the future. I mean, I can't tell you if it's going to go up or down. I mean, in theory, every piece of technology we have today is always cheaper in the future because it gets better and better, but there's no certainty in that. So, anybody in the audience have any comments on this? Yes, sir. Let me take this gentleman first, and then Carol will talk to you. Yes, sir.
Hi, Chairman and Directors and staff. I'm Steve Nash. I'm a resident of Oxnard. And I was going to talk on the issue of credits, but the way I see it is you have 600,000 acre-feet in conservation credits. Why not forget your Tier 1 fee, jump immediately to your Tier 2, which would generate $1,100 per acre-foot, and I would exclude the farmers and just base this on the M&I users. So you're talking about for every 900 acre-feet you're generating $1 million. This is a cash cow. You have 600,000 acre-feet in conservation credits. The money is there. You just have to have the political and personal courage to manage your resource, and that's how can you manage your resource if you don't know what the resource is? And I thank you.
Okay, thank you. Carol.
Carol Schoen, Zone Mutual Water Company, Chair Mulhart, board members. This morning we discussed this agenda item at the Las Posas Basin Users Group. And out of the 35 to 40 members that were attending, the question went around the room. There was no support for this. It was asked, does anybody in this room lend this any support? And I realized, listening to the discussion of how the county reads their meters, you won't be replacing county meters, probably municipal meters, any of those fancy technical meters that are already in place. You're looking for volunteers. And maybe the thing to do is put this off, send out a card and see, are you going to get 140 meters volunteered for this program before you go ahead with it? Because you're spending a lot of staff time, and we're going to spend GMA dollars to match these funds. Maybe there's not even the support out there to test much of this. And the other comment I would have about voluntary, it's not that people choose to report or not report what they're pumping. Everybody's required to report what they're pumping. And there are regulations and there are penalties for not properly reporting. And there's meter calibration that's in place for every 3 years. And maybe we just need to concentrate the staff's efforts and the GMA's efforts on our basin plans and all of the other allocation credits, all the other issues, and let this go for a bit and see what happens. I really don't see where this is going to be anything other than kind of a diversion of staff resources to discover something from a group that probably already you have all the information that you would need. Now, if you needed to know month by month what ag is pumping, you could probably get some volunteers to do that type of reporting if that's going to help a model. But just to step into this and spend these dollars when a couple more agenda items down, the agency is saying that they're short on technical staff, and you're looking to put on more outside resources to help with staff time. So it kind of all doesn't come together, and I just thought it was important for the board to realize that of all the mutuals in the room, all the individual farmers in the room, there was no support. So that might be the first question. Can we get 140 meters?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sam?
Sam McIntyre, Brewood Water, Director and Chairman. I'd like to direct the information, basically, Mr. Bennett's statement that the best resource we have is the water in the Las Posas aquifer. And if we don't do more studies, and I wish you could be at the meetings of the Las Posas pumpers, because the problems that are coming up and the studies we're going to have to do to be able to keep water, to meter, you got to have water to meter if you're going to use a meter. And to keep that water are going to be very expensive, and there are dire consequences. We need them. And I want you people, directors, to think about, let's get the water problem settled in the Las Posas Valley for the aquifer. And with the amount of money we're going to be spending for reverse osmosis and other items out there to keep that water in that aquifer, that should come first before we go off in any type of a situation where we're going to start these studies for pilot programs which aren't going to help us keep any water in that aquifer, because there's not going to be anything there to meter if you don't help us keep the water there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Anybody else?
Robert Aranio, Crestview Mutual. Well, this is a good one. Michelle brought up a lot of discussion points. As I was sitting back there, I was thinking of a couple things. I've got some agricultural customers that I work with out in the Las Posas Valley, and I can certainly appreciate what Sheila deals with, because the numbers that I get frequently are difficult to understand and require considerable time to clean up. But with that said, also looking at what some of our issues are that we're looking at and trying to understand, and the dollars and cents that we're looking at in this budget, it's hard for me not to better understand and quantify what is our resource that's in the ground and studies for what we're talking about up there in the Las Posas Valley and throughout before we go for this new technology. And the tipping point for me on it was when we did the meter calibration program. Being a champion of that and pushing on that, I had some very preconceived notions as to what would come from that program, and they turned out to be all wrong. Straight up missed it, where I thought that we're grossly under-recording. When everything balanced out, we're actually very close, and the meter calibration program in that first run through certified that. So I'm not sure that we're at such a point here where we've got this discrepancy in this information that's being provided to us, other than paperwork issues, that we're going to get a lot to gain on this. And I feel that there could be more bang for the buck in dealing with the issues that we're dealing with up there in the Las Posas Valley, and studies that need to be completed in order to understand where our water's underground and how it moves and what is the quantity of water below ground. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Carol brings up a very interesting concept, and maybe the solution maybe the solution would be is if we drafted a letter that explains exactly what the program is about, one and a half page letter, and ask for people to volunteer their wells. Let's do that. Maybe we need to find out, as you said, maybe we need to find out, do we have people that volunteer? And if we don't have volunteers, then we have obviously a problem. On the other hand, if we get an overwhelming response, it offsets, it's kind of a backdoor way of doing a market sample of what your constituents are willing to do. And it wouldn't cost us that much to do. We have the time, as I understand from you and from Jeff. We don't have to tell the state tomorrow that we're taking the grant or denying the grant. So between now and our September meeting, maybe in August, we can at least get out a letter and see what kind of response we get. That was Carol's suggestion, so I'm throwing that out. Good idea. Rather than trying to vote on it today, because there's still obviously issues, maybe we ought to do at least that.
I'd suggest we put a boomerang card in there with stamp on it so that we don't ask them to put a stamp on that.
Mike will volunteer his horse and ride to every well owner he knows. For the record, Mike has agreed to, and he'll do a vet check while he's there. You fill out the card, I'll do the vet check. That's what Mike just said, right? Did I put words in your mouth? Okay, all right. No vaccines, just vet checks. I think that's what you said. So, how about that as a direction? I know this item has been rolled a couple times, and I thought it was important that we at least have some debate about it, and see if we can flush out what the issues were. So maybe the first step is let's draft a letter to explain what the nature of the program and the whys and what it should accomplish. A position paper if you want, simple. See if we can get some volunteers, and let's see what that response is. Put it back on the agenda for September and tell us what the response is, and we'll make some decision then. Okay?
Okay. Only suggestion I'd have is put it back on the, if they get it all done, they get the stuff. I mean, if it takes them until October,
yeah.
Whether it's...
When you have a response that's worth looking at, put it on the agenda. Okay? You okay with that, Mike?
We can do that. We conducted an informal poll months and months ago, and I don't have the exact numbers, but we got about 20 people saying they'd be interested in it.
Okay, 20 is not 140.
No, it isn't.
So
it's
let's...
20.
But was that 100% survey, or was it a number?
What we're talking about doing now, I think, is a real good approach by sending a survey out to the well owners.
But I mean, if you had 20 out of 50 people you called, well, then that would be a pretty good response.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We had 20 people approach us. We didn't say, I don't mind, I don't mind, I don't mind.
Let's use this as a informal test of the marketplace to see what kind of reception we get, and use that as just one more issue to resolve the fact people want it or don't want it, and it gives the board members a chance to think about it. With response to the gentleman's issue about the 600 and some odd thousand acre feet, that water does not exist. It's a paper accounting thing. So there's no money behind that, so that's not going to solve the problem. But again, it's a pilot program for me, but if we can't even get the pilot program off the table because we don't have enough people across the board, then we're just wasting our time. Okay? All right? Let's move on. Thank you. I don't need to bang anything. I just move on. There we go. Hey! Look at this. We're at number 4.
Mr. Chairman,
all because of Tom. If Tom had not come in, Tom, it's your fault. You understand that? Here's the City of Camarillo contingency right there. It's your fault. It's been noted.
If you could find a fast plane to leave on, and Charlotte could run the rest of the meeting, we'll be gone.
I'm flying to Honolulu these days, guys. You have no idea how more I won't say.
We've been saving these up and rolling them over for when you came back.
Yeah. Contract with Irrigation Training Center. Let's see if we can make this a very short presentation. Either we're for it or against it. That's what it's going to boil down to.
Shall we vote now?
Well, let me cut. I'm going to start cutting corners here. Is there anybody in the audience that is against this board advancing the irrigation training and research process that we started with regards to this efficiency? Anybody against it? If this is a yes for 4, that's what I want to see in the audience.
I make a motion to move forward.
All right. A motion has been made to move forward and to accept staff's recommendation.
Yes.
Second.
All in, well, where did Steve go? We're going to get the
It doesn't matter. He's not here.
All right. Let's do it because we're spending money. Let's do it as a roll call.
Chair Mulhart.
Yes.
Director Craven.
Yes.
Director Kelly.
Yes.
Director Schwabauer.
Yes.
See, I can do what Charlotte does if you just give me the opportunity. Let's deal with number 5, credits. All right, Gerhard, you know that your time is not on your side, so let's go quickly.
Well,
Make like a rabbit.
I have about 10 slides,
All right.
10 minutes, so I can be quick.
There you go.
Your pleasure in terms of how we want to move forward.
Run it as the gong show. If it gets too bad, I'll gong you. So.
And the first, put a little bit of levity into the meeting. Don't protest the messenger. As we know, this credit issue has been a bit contentious. So, actually, Curtis, you'll probably recognize this group. Previous project I worked on. Anyway. All right, here we go. So, just a recap of the background. We have 714,528 acre feet of conservation credits on the books.
as of the end of 2010. As you know, our current ordinance has no limitations, either accumulation cap or any redemption rules in place. And as we've mentioned before, we believe that credits may interfere with achieving our sustainability of our groundwater resources. I'll show some graphs you've seen before. Perhaps there's been some reverse progress in our 5% cutbacks. We have the issues of credits versus supplemental water and the potentially to create a market for these credits. As we frame the problem, we have this allocation system, historical allocation system that exceeds the yield of our basins. And I like to frame the issue in terms of water budget. Think of the deficit. If you want to talk about state deficit, you want to talk about what the federal government's dealing with right now in terms of caps and accumulation of, if you want to call this virtual water or script. We believe that the conservation credits earned are not actually backed by actual groundwater, and thus, when redeemed, this overdraft is realized at that time. So, fundamentally, the problem with conservation credits are they're earned by not pumping water that's not available to begin with. This is a slide graph that we've put up before. We do need to update it. At that point, it was approaching 700,000. It's now above 700,000. This is another slide that we've put up before. First line is the base period average pumping. The original basin yield estimate, a little bit below 125. These are our stepwise reductions. These are the pumping that's occurred since 1991 and the credits that have been earned over time. The credit program was initiated in 1991. That's why the graph starts at that point. And prior to, another point is prior to 1998, operators were not required to apply. They were required to apply for credits. Since then, it's automatic.
With that chart, could you explain why, let's take a year like 2008. How is it that 2008, the pumping and the credits earned could be greater than the allocations or the...
Gordon, you want to help me with the... I'm going to ask for a variety of help probably through this presentation as we...
The simple answer, Director Bennett, is there's multiple allocation opportunities. The black line showing the ramp down allocation is that showing the historical allocation only. There is opportunity to pump against an efficiency allocation or a baseline. So although the pumping there is shown in excess of the historical, that's because some of it's applied against different allocation types.
So the efficiency allocation and those kind of things are allowing pumping to actually be higher than historical?
That's correct.
And so that's why you can still be getting credits and still be pumping more than historical.
Not the same guy.
Yeah. But the total.
In aggregate.
In aggregate, the system can have, that's what I mean, you can still be building credits up at the same time that you're actually pumping more than the historical.
Precisely.
Thanks, Brian.
I can pump less than my historical allocation, earn a credit, and be way down in my pumping, and then a guy across the street, because of the growing or whatever, he's operating on efficiency, he doesn't earn any credits, but because of the way we've set the efficiency program falsely, we are over pumping in that area, and hence what we just voted on to keep this whole momentum going and dealing with irrigation efficiency, now irrigation indexing. Those numbers should come down, in theory.
Okay. This is also a graph that we presented to you previously, and I'm going to put another line that's going to come. These are the stepwise 5% reduction, now fully at 25%. You can see there's a rough correlation with the stepwise reduction. You have seen in certain areas an increase in credit redemption. Okay. I'm going to move now to
I just want to make a comment. And if you go back to 2 slides, in the long run, that's not sustainable. Right. Okay. Got it.
So we've started this discussion, it's gone back, and I've looked at some of the records. 2007, 2009, we had some of the initial discussion at the TAG and SAG level. There was an ad hoc committee formed in early 2010. As you recall, a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, we had a credit study session before you. We had detailed presentation and graphs. We had a follow-up board session in September of that year, and that summary is attached as 5A to today's staff report. And at that time, your board determined that the trend of accumulating conservation credits and lack of credit accumulation redemption rules required further evaluation. You then directed the Strategic Advisory Group to investigate these concerns about conservation credits and develop policy recommendations for future board consideration. And the following questions were to be addressed. Are conservation credits a potential impediment to achieving safe yield? And does the ordinance code contain loopholes that would allow conservation credits to be excessively used or marketed or sold? So that was the directive to SAG. And we embarked down that path. As part of item 5B, you'll see that we put together a summary of the issues and as well as the goals, and that was distributed to the group. They met 3 times in October and November 2010, and again in March 2011 of this year. There was 2 subcommittees formed, Ag and M&I. They met separately in January. The M&I group met 3 times, February, March, and May, and we also included part of that discussion in terms of what type of responses to the original questions. We've included that as 5C to your staff report today. So point being, a lot of meetings, a lot of discussion, a lot of staff work, summarized to a certain degree in the staff report as well as the attachments. And one of the outcomes that we worked on, M&I group came up with their first draft of an M&I draft redemption policy. We looked at that. We came back with a revision. We worked with Robert and developed a joint credit redemption policy. That's attached as 5D of your staff report today. We presented that and discussed it at length with the M&I group. I won't go into too much detail, but this policy is relatively straightforward. I've tried to make it 1 page, simple principles. But basically, the policy encapsulates both the market-based approach that Robert had presented to your board at a previous board meeting, as well as several new policies, some of them that have been included and discussed in front of your board. So we try to encapsulate both that and some new policies into that draft redemption policy. Unfortunately, we could not get consensus with the group at these meetings, so that's where it stands. So where are we today? SAG process didn't fully address the board's directive. We still have a large number of the conservation credits still on the books. We believe generally this amount exceeds the amount that we believe is necessary for operational flexibility. As I mentioned before, there is no credit redemption, accumulation, or cap in our current ordinance. And again, restating that it may interfere with achieving sustainability of our groundwater resource. And just further, reverse progress you've made on the 25% cutbacks, potential for the credit markets, and that even a small redemption, for example, of even to take 10% of what's on the books, that would equal, for example, if you just take 40,000, 10%, and that number is potentially problematic. So, options for you today, certainly status quo. If you want no further action, that is certainly an option that you can direct staff to proceed with. You can also have the problem redefined and redirect SAG to evaluate that. And then option 3 is that you direct staff to place on a future agenda a credit policy for board consideration or redraft the policy that we have as part of your attachment today.
Okay. Mike, did you want to say anything? Okay.
And that concludes the presentation.
Let me go across the floor. Let me start this way. Any questions?
No.
You, Mike. Okay. First of all, I want to thank staff and Mike and all of you for addressing an issue that the board has raised. And I think we held an extensive amount of study session, workshops, and the like. And so I applaud you for that. And I know it's been on the agenda and rolled a couple times as we try to sort our way through this. The feedback I've gotten is that people don't believe we have a credit problem, we have an allocation problem, as I said earlier. I'm not in total agreement with that position, but I'm hearing that's where people believe we ought to spend our time and energy is on the allocation side of the equation. So, and as we talked about just a few minutes ago, we have a limited amount of staff time and staff money. And so we need to spend time in those areas and take what we've heard from essentially our constituents and that they don't believe at this point in time this is a problem. Interesting enough, staff just put in front of us a letter from the State Water Resources Control Board that we just received a couple days ago. And in that, they've reflected the fact it's been 30 years since we established GMA. They kind of want a status report of where we are and where we're going. And one of the things it says in the letter is, and oh, by the way, you have a credit program. How's it impacting the aquifer? And I do remember when Mike went to Washington and dealt with FERC on our relicensing, one of the issues that was raised is you guys have so many credits out there, you don't have a water problem. And I know that in dealing with the fish and bugs and bunny folks, dealing with the Santa Clara River, the issue was raised. You've got so many credits, you don't have a water problem. And even today, we had a gentleman talking about how we can cash in on our credits as a way of generating funds. And so it raises for me a number of red flags, and the red flags are this is not real water and it's not real money, but it's leaving people with the perception that somehow we're wasting water, and therefore by wasting water we accrue a whole bunch of credits that somehow exist that we can always turn to as if it were money in the bank. It's not real water, it's Confederate money. And I think the board was right in its decision to take a look at this, and out of this conversation has come a discussion that we ought to look at allocation. And I think we ought to do that. With regards to the credit issue, I think my sense right now is we ought to go with staff recommendation number 1, and we ought to just table the issue of the credit discussion. That's kind of where I am mentally right now. We ought to shift the time and energy and deal with the issue of allocation. And in the process of dealing with allocation, if the issue of credits has an impact in that allocation discussion, it will be a complement to a discussion of allocation. But what I'm hearing from folks is we ought to talk about allocation. So my personal feeling is that in your staff recommendation, item 5, there's options. Right now, status quo, no further action. Now, the other option would be, if you go to option 2, redefine the problem and direct, I mean, it's basically we're keeping the thing alive, and that's not what I'm hearing from folks. If we go to option 3, direct staff to place on a future agenda a redemption policy, I think at some point in time we may have to do that, but I don't see it in the short term, and I don't see it being done without in the context of a discussion of allocation. Hence, that's why I'm leaning towards option 1. And with that, I see Carol comes up. She wants to say something. So.
Carol Schoen, Zone Mutual Water, Chairman Mulhart, Board of Directors. I remember in one of our Ag Committee meetings with Mike, maybe Mike remembers, as a group we thought that it might really help looking at this if we could retire those inactive credits that we keep looking at, so that if 25% of this number that keeps being shown and it keeps increasing, we have a number of inactive, abandoned credits. Can we ask that those be removed?
Okay, what you're then suggesting is that we actually go with option 3, and that we direct staff to put on the agenda, and maybe it's not a credit redemption policy, but a credit retirement policy as an interim step, and deal with the short-term things that you talked about. I'm okay with that.
I think that if if you're going to have, in the future, if we're presenting credit numbers to the State Water Resources Control Board and all, if that number is 25% less because of, a lot of those are abandoned and inactive and never to be redeemed, it's silly to keep looking at it. And I know that was what came out of our committee meeting, was the request that those get retired somehow. So I would ask that we look at getting rid of what isn't real.
Yeah, okay. And again, you referencing what I just said, I think the Water Resources Control Board, like a lot of folks, they look at press clippings or in contact with other folks in this business, and the issue of us having excessive credits actually hurts us because people perceive it as real water. It is not real water. There's no way that we could ever suck it out of the ground, and if we did, we'd overdraft our basin so fast it wouldn't be funny. It's an accounting method that we put in place to account for off years of drought, and now it's taken on a life of its own. So I'm okay with going with option 3 if that's the answer. 1 second here. Dave, you had a question or a comment?
No, I would reiterate, I think Carol's idea is very good. Okay. I mean, there are a lot of wells out there that need to be looked at.
All right, well, it means then we go with option 3 and not option 1.
Mike might remember, but in the Oxnard Plains Users Group, that same thing was brought up, and I thought it was going to come to being. It just hasn't had. But the same thing was, I thought it was a directive to tell you to go do it, and obviously it hasn't been done.
Okay. Before you speak, hold on. Yes, sir.
Hi, Chair and Directors. I'm Steve Nash. I'm a resident of Oxnard, and I apologize for, taking up your time. But this is a hugely important issue. And if you don't address this issue today, you're abrogating your duty of preserving and protecting this most valuable of resources. And I do have some comments. First of all, 10% of 714,000 acre feet is 71,000 acre feet. My understanding is that the sustainable yield is 100,000 acre feet a year. We're currently at 130,000, probably plus. If you add a 10% redemption to that, we're at 200,000 acre feet a year. That's insane. That's pure insanity. The conservation credits never should have been allowed to accrue without definitive regulations or redemption procedures. You must not allow a market to develop that allows the trading or selling of conservation credits. You must try to put this genie back into the bottle. It will take personal and political courage, but that is your agency's purpose. In the current overdraft situation, there is no capacity to allow for the utilization of, in the report it said 600,000 acre feet, but I'm hearing it's 714,000 acre feet of groundwater conservation credits. Surcharges for pumping above the user's allocation will not deter M&I users. They will simply pass the cost on to their customers. This is unfair and ineffective, totally ineffective. And my understanding is Oxnard plans to exercise and expend all of its credits, 30,000 acre feet with Fox Canyon, 7,000 with United, within the next 4 or 5 years. So you can say that this is not real water, and I understand that. But the people who have the agencies who have the conservation credits, they do recognize it as real water, and they're going to heavily impact this resource that we're all interested in protecting. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Good afternoon, Robert Aranio with Crestview Mutual.
Robert, you realize that you've been up here more than Rob Saperstein at the same meeting, and that you could actually take ahead of him in the future if you keep doing this.
I'm trying to shame him into coming up here.
I understand that, and he's chomping at the bit over there, but I'm just telling you.
We'll see if this subject brings it up.
There you go.
First off, I want to thank staff for their patience and for spending as much time with me on this as it did trying to float an idea in order to get this to work. After going through everything and talking about this ad nauseum at the M&I committee meetings that we're doing, I still believe technically we can draft a policy that will work. The numbers on here are movable, and I think it's something that could be done and we can get consensus on. The problem that we have is that there's a philosophical debate there as to whether or not we're actually accomplishing anything by doing it. And that is something I was unable to overcome or address. And that's pretty much why this has died at the time. And staff, I believe, did a good job encapsulating what those comments were in their staff report on page 2. I forget which paragraph it was. But, excuse me for a moment here. Yeah, in their conclusion report as to what the discussions were that came out of this. I would also support option number 3 for this to be looked at again, and first off, retiring those credits that we know. There was a similar idea that came up with from the M&I side that we can agree on, that those credits have not been used or the operator is no longer around, especially we said for over 5 years, that those be deleted and taken off the books so we don't have to hear them again. And then we step forward on this, continue to work with this. Thank you.
Okay. Before you leave, I would be remiss if I didn't say that Robert brought this concept to me that he drafted, and we talked about it, and I encouraged him that I thought it was a good policy. And just as Carol has come up with a couple of good ideas today, I can't give her credit going back 15 years. I'm not going to do that, but today, right? I think this room is filled with people that have good thinking caps. And I applaud you, Robert, for taking the time to come up with an idea and trying to sell it. And if it didn't sell, that's okay. That's what we do at the board. We try to sell ideas, and as you well know, they don't get sold. But somebody is thinking. And I would encourage you, and I would encourage others. The message I got was it was not a credit problem. It's an allocation problem. And I'm committed to directing the board and asking the board to direct staff. We've got to tackle then the allocation issue. And I don't want to go down the same road, have people say, well, it's not an allocation issue, it's some other issue. Folks, we're going to have to address this issue. I cannot keep in good conscience watching us push it aside. So I compliment you, Robert, on dealing with the credit issue. If it now becomes an allocation issue and you've got some other good ideas, or anybody in the audience have some good ideas that you think will solve the problem, I'm more than happy to ask the board to create the forum where we can debate it and run it up and down the flagpole. And at some point in time, I think this board is going to have to act and direct its staff to come up with some policy and essentially put it out there. And if you don't like it, you better come up with some other alternative, because we have to move this ball down the road. What we're doing, as you just said, is not sustainable, and we've got to make changes. And we've got too many outside influences pushing us. And when the state board said after 30 years it's time to see how goes it, when Big Brother decides to come down the door, I better have an answer for him. We better have an answer for him. So I compliment you on your outline. I encourage others, if they have some solution to the allocation problem, we have to deal with that. Rob, you have said repeatedly it's an allocation problem. John Matthews has said it's an allocation problem. You guys, I need your help. The board needs your help. We all need each other's help to put on our thinking cap and come up with a solution to this problem. We'll create the forum to debate it, but I got to have some ideas. Okay? Mike.
Mike Solomon, United Water Conservation District. One of the other things, as I chaired these committee meetings, I was very glad that they put up there that it was the board that said there was a problem, not me, because I got accused of me creating the problem.
Our intent was to have them sling at you, not us, and it worked.
You did well. One of the, if you go with option number 3, one of the items that's been brought up to me, and I agree with it. Another option is United's facilities. We deliver water to the Pleasant Valley County Water District, surface water, and to the pumping trough pipeline, both areas that are some of our biggest concerns. Yet, when we deliver that surface water, the farmers can build up credits. And maybe as we look at 3, we deal with that issue, because that's how a lot of these credits have been accumulated, is by United getting water from the forebay or off surface water off Santa Clara River, moving it to an area because there's not enough water there to pump, yet we're letting them build up credits. So besides that 150, and Carol's correct, we did talk about removing those 100, I think it was 150,000 acre feet of the 600 at that time. We should get those off the books. Because what I'm hearing in the environmental issues United we're dealing with, in Washington, they knew about those credit issues already. They said, why are you arguing about taking more water to the fish? You don't need it. You got 600,000 acre feet of credit. You banked water. And I said, whoa, that's not how it works. But anyway, I would suggest that if you go with option 3, we look at even possibly going back and looking at the credits that have been built up based on surface water. We already have some works in plan with GMA on how we deal with the groundwater we pump from the Satacoy well field or a pumping trough pipeline that the credits get offset by the pumpers that receive the pumped water. We should also deal with the surface water that's being provided those areas too. So just that could be worked in. I think that would take care of a big chunk of the numbers.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Jared Bouchard, Channel Islands Beach Community Services District. As I've had an opportunity to attend and be part of these, I just want to, if the board is going to proceed forward with option number 3, one of the issues was, particularly for speaking from the M&I group and why the consensus couldn't be met, was we felt like we were trying to legislate ourselves without knowing what the big picture. Now we're talking about allocation, ag efficiency, these other things, and some of the staff comments that were received during these or presented were that we were trying to minimize and take some of the smaller issues up front and deal with them, and the credits was, I guess, deemed as one of those issues, which obviously it was not. I think you can deal with the retired credit issues very simply. And I was one of those vocal people that could not support the draft principles that Mr. Ranio brought forward. Since then, I think have had a bit of a change of heart, and that there is some possibility to support something like this. But in order for us to look at these and begin, I guess, offering some legislation of our credits against ourselves, we need to really see what's going to happen on a whole so that we understand that picture. We've all been placed in this, particularly, not trying to be inflammatory here, but from the M&I end, the majority of us has met those cutbacks. And the game has changed for us now when we've done some long-term planning. And now we're going to look at taking those credits and those things away from us. And for the health and welfare of the aquifer, I think that can be done. But we need to know what the big picture is going to look like at the end of the day in order to really draft something that's comprehensive and not try and piecemeal.
And I think your comment about and the message I got was, instead of tackling on the credit side of the equation, start on the allocation side and let the allocation flow back down to dealing with the credits. And so, shifting that focus, I think, will be helpful. So, but anybody else have any comments on this? All right, the recommendation, my original. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I've been waving my finger.
No, I'm sorry. There's a reason why my eye doesn't go this way. If it didn't, I wouldn't fly.
I don't think I agree with the statement that we don't have a credit problem, we have an allocation problem. I think we have a credit problem and an allocation problem.
I agree with that.
And I think we need to deal with both of them. And we have come up with some recommendations from at least some of the M&I users. I think we do need to look at retiring those certain credits you talked about earlier. But I think we shouldn't say we're not going to talk about this anymore. We should just table this discussion until we've had some discussions about allocations. My guess is that we're going to have the same comments from people. I don't want my allocation lowered, but lower theirs. I don't care which side of it you're on. You're going to want the other guy's allocation lowered. If you're M&I users, you're going to want the agricultural users lowered or changed in some way. If you're an agricultural user, you're going to say lower the allocations for the M&I people. So I think maybe, it didn't work to have two separate groups. Maybe we need to put people in the room and let them battle it out instead of saying, you guys come up with a plan for you and you guys come up with a plan for you. I don't know. I'm just saying that we've been talking about this particular thing for several years now and come to no conclusion, except people agree that if you haven't been operating a well for years, you shouldn't have credits. And I think we should have gotten farther than that. So I'm expressing a little frustration here, but maybe our process for developing these policies or these resolutions needs to be changed. I don't know what it is, but I do know we need to work a little faster than we have been on both of these. And we can't say, okay, we're going to start working on allocations now, so we've put this behind us. We need to just tell people we've tabled the discussion of credits and we're going to bring it back at a later date and maybe talk about the whole thing all together at the end.
Okay, anybody else?
Mr. Chairman, it looks like as we move along in the Las Posas that the template is probably going to include a cap on extractions allowed, and that plays along. It doesn't matter how many credits you'd have. You could only use, depends on what the final number is, but what we've been using is 4 acre-feet in our interim. So you could have 1,000 credits on 100 acres, and you could not use other than 400 a year. And probably be what you might be generating, depending on what your allocation was. So that takes an opportunity for somebody with an excessive pocket full of credits from using them, because it doesn't matter how the hell they get to there, they cannot exceed the cap on extraction. So the boogie-boo of people sucking the place dry goes away. Then the real thing is, how do you appear not to be hoarding things, like out in the desert, I forgot what the name of the company is that bought, all the desert with the water. Anyway, we're not going to be able to extract water from here and sell it off to Mojave or someplace. But if that's the image we're giving, then we need to address that. But I think if the template that's being developed in the Las Posas does move forward to the rest of the agency, then that cap would keep people from using more than their justifiable amount is.
Steve?
Yeah, the first thing I want to ask about is just to make sure that we're not getting ourselves in trouble policy-wise. And we're talking about retiring credits, and I think everybody goes, "Hey, we should retire those things that are off the books." My question is for county council, for our council and for our staff. Is it really clear which credits are credits that should be retired? And
to answer the question, there are a number of inactive, but we should probably come back to your board to make sure that you understand those that we would be deleting. And
yeah, because a question I'd have is, do they have legal rights? Do they? It may be we may want to get those off, but I also don't want to introduce a lawsuit just because we retired somebody's credits and they didn't have due process and all of those kind of things. So, do you have any due process concerns?
I don't know if it's a due process concern, but it is a matter that could not be done administratively, because under the ordinance as currently drafted, there is no provision for retirement of credits, so it would require a legislative action by your board to do that.
Right. So we'd have to look carefully at what are the criteria for retirement and what aren't, which would be the beginning of a credit policy, I suppose. Right?
Correct. Notification and public hearing and the whole thing.
And all of that. So that's going to take some time, all right, for us for us to be able to do that, right? Okay. The other point I would make is that historically it is always difficult when particularly users of a resource that is becoming more and more precious, whether it's running out of fish in the ocean or other aquifers around or whatever, that it's difficult to make the hard decisions, and there's always a built-in incentive to push things down the road. And I think listening to Director Craven's comments, I think it's important for us to recognize that there are hard decisions coming, and efficiency credits and these credits, all of these things are situations where it's like harder decisions than the ones that have been made are certainly going to be coming down the road. So I agree completely. We have a credits problem and we have an allocation problem. The question is, what's the right way to handle them? And if, in fact, you're saying we'll postpone this outside of dealing with the retirement of them, or we will but if we're going to do that only because we're going to roll that into part of a grand scheme that starts with allocation, I don't mind starting with allocation, and perhaps that's the more appropriate place to start. But it is time to start, and I think out of that will come, and it will take a willingness to lead, because there will be hard decisions, truly hard decisions ahead, and people will have to step up and lead on those decisions. And that doesn't mean people haven't been stepping up and doing some good creative thinking so far. I think in many ways it's a group of people that do think well about that. But we've got to combine good thinking with at some point in time, when is it that we have to actually start. So I view this as, if we're postponing on credits, which at least carries with us, we recognize perception risk, right, that create legal challenges and all of that. I might offer, imagine if we start having litigation of the basin. Imagine how complicating credits could be in that. Imagine how complicating, if you're litigating, imagine how, you don't even really know how much extraction you have, right? You can't guarantee that. All those issues are going to come up, and I think that they're just ones that we have to deal with. So I'm happy to support the motion if it is the beginning of really, of tying credits to allocations, and we're getting ready to begin to do that.
All right, hold on. Dave, do you have something? Okay. Mike.
Mike Solomon, United Water. Well, I might be the one that's going to put the elephant in the room out on front, but a lot of the discussion we heard at SAG, and as I was listening to Director Craven, it made me realize we're not answering the whole question. Maybe we need to go to option 2. And it's not just an allocation problem. Irrigation efficiency. You can change the allocations all day, but irrigation efficiency, as long as people can pump, even under the new system, let's say under the current system, irrigation efficiency, you're pumping 3.5 feet per acre for strawberry, let's just say. But under the new system, the index, you're now at 3.1. That's still more water than the aquifer can afford. So it's not just an allocation issue, it's the irrigation efficiency and the credits. You got to look at all three, or we're never going to get to safe yield. So I guess it's more option 2, but I don't, being the person that coordinated, facilitated SAG, I don't want to come back to me on this because it'll be my problem again. But I think it's a bigger problem than just the allocation credit. You got to address, we just did put the money out there to study how to teach people to do more efficiently, but what we're finding is maybe even efficiently, we can't afford the crops we're farming unless we do something else. So I'd further the question and maybe go from 3 back up to 2, and let's really define that, what we're trying to solve.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Bob Krimmer, I'm an associate of John Matthews. On the issue of misperception of third parties, I would just caution against making any policy based on a third-party misperception. I would focus on correcting the misperception. If they are interpreting credits as water, then disabuse them of that notion. As far as credits go, we don't see credits as a problem. During the meetings with the ag group, there was a challenge put out. Please define where the abuse is. Please give us examples of the abuse If those examples can be identified, then let's discuss policies to address those abuses. There are no examples of abuse. So it's hard to understand, at least in the ag community, why the credits are a problem. Like to see some examples of that a problem, and they just don't emerge. It's speculative. For that reason, I would support option number 2 and not option number 3, and begin to look and redefine, if you want to call it a problem, or redefine the issue, and try to evaluate exactly what we're trying to accomplish here, and simply not base policy on speculation. Thank you.
Okay. Look at here. Rob. I knew it.
Rob Saperstein for the City of Oxnard. Somehow I've gotten a bum rap because I really have not been up here very frequently.
I know.
And maybe I'll try and reframe it on a happy note, because I really don't characterize this as a problem. And I was one of those folks, as Director Mulhart said, I'd redefine what it is we're attempting to try to deal with, not solve as though it's a problem. We've got stuff we still need to deal with. The fact that there is an accumulation of credits means that we're doing the right thing. We're doing things like participating in the supplemental M&I program, the Canal Creek project, that brings in new water supplies, that creates the ability to transfer water around, and the end result of it is it generates what we're calling conservation credits. It's actually new water brought into the system. It's why those numbers are going up. Another example is the use of imported water in the basin. When the City of Oxnard relaxes its pumping of groundwater and takes more imported water from Cayugas, the result is earning of a conservation credit, but that's because it's done a good thing. It's bought imported water. So if that number is growing, it means we're using new water supplies in the basin. Now, if we've got a nomenclature problem and the perception problem that Bob describes, then yeah, let's deal with it. Maybe we need to talk about some fraction of the credits that shouldn't be properly characterized as conservation credits. They are tools to help move water supplies around the basin that, at least as recently as a couple of years ago, we thought were critically important. City of Oxnard spent a lot of money to participate in those projects, and that's the resistance, to the extent Oxnard's been a part of the dialogue. That's the resistance you hear from them when you say, well, wait a minute, those credits should go away, place limits on them. They're really functional tools to help the city justify spending lots of money to participate in new water supplies. So I would hate for anything we do to somehow throw cold water on those good programs. The reality is, no matter how many acre feet of credits we build up in this basin, we only have a limited demand. We have no ability to export groundwater outside of the basin, except for maybe indirectly, and Cayugas is not going to participate in that. There's going to be no run on the bank. To me, it's a happy problem. It means we're doing the right thing. If, again, we need to correct the perception that somehow we're generating a Kern County water bank that somehow is going to move all the water out of the basin in the future. Problem. People misunderstand the rules that already exist that limit people's behaviors here. So again, I think it's a happy problem to have. That means we're doing the right thing. What Oxnard has always suggested when we've spent a whole lot of staff time and everybody's time dealing with this issue is focus on bringing in more new water supplies. Focus on moving and creating incentives to move pumping from stressed areas to less stressed areas smartly, but to focus on those things rather than spending a bunch of time over issues that are just sort of scratching a wound unnecessarily. We heard lots of folks say that credits are important to them for whatever different reasons, and it's fighting words to say we're going to change the rules when we've relied on the current rules for 30 years, when changing the rules won't change people's behavior. It won't incentivize them to participate in the new projects, and that's really what we'd like to spend our time talking about. Whether that's 1, 2, or 3, I'll leave that up to you how we get there, but sure would like to be spending our time on those things.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Tom?
I was going to say what Rob said. Exactly.
Are you battling?
He really did well.
What is this, the Rob, Bob,
yeah.
and Tom show here, trying to see who can get up the most?
You know, I'm just compelled to say this, and, you know, the city of Camarillo has worked very hard on conserving water. I was just looking at some of our past history as far as the water that we've pumped from the ground, and in 1989, we pumped 4,100 acre feet, and in 2010, we pumped 4,000 acre feet. So we're trying very hard not to abuse the groundwater, and we will continue to do that. And we are a growing city. Thank you, Rob. So, thank you.
You know, in fairness to, thank Tom. In fair, we created the credit program with the best of intentions, and that is to put in place a mechanism to get from wet to dry years. That was the intent. And over the 20 years that system has been in place, I think it's been close to 20 years, the number has grown for a variety of reasons. And there is a perception. Tackling that perception is tough because people don't believe. So I think you got to tackle the perception. I understand that. I believe that there are some credits on the books that are good credits. The credits that Kiegas has put on the books because of the work they've done are good credits for the right reasons. The credits that the city of Oxnard will put on the books as part of their GREAT program will work their way back into solving the city of Oxnard's problem. That's a good system. So there are credits that work. There are credits that work for individual growers that get through wet to dry years. All of that works. The question is we have three things, and I agree, we have three things working simultaneously. We have an allocation issue, we have an efficiency issue, and we have a credit issue. And the board's direction was start at the credit issue side of the equation. Simultaneously in doing that, Kiegas offered and the Las Posas users group agreed to tackle the use of their area as a sub-basin, and the GMA board has supported that, and we have allocated a tremendous amount of time with Brian and staff and your folks there at Kiegas and all of the constituency, and every time you guys come in and report to me, the progress is being made and it's getting better. Every meeting is getting better. We're now putting pen to paper, and we have said that if we can get the Las Posas area to function, it could be a template on how we might use it in the Oxnard Plain. So we have a number of things going simultaneously. We just agreed to expand on the irrigation efficiency process. So I would argue that we, in effect, are dealing with each of these issues not in a particularly linear way, but in a multitasking way. If you guys can come up with a solution for your allocation, and if it's a capping system, and we can show that to the Oxnard Plain, and it works on Oxnard Plain, and the growers on the Oxnard Plain say that'll work for us, we've accomplished that task. I originally envisioned dealing with the credit issue and everything would flow up from that. I think it needs to go back the other way, which now brings us to the question. I believe option one, I will change my position. I have the right to do that, you know. Option number one is not an option. It doesn't work. My problem with option number two is redefine the problem, direct SAG to reevaluate, puts Mike and others, Henry and others, right in the middle of the bore site, and I'm not sure they want to be there. And also, it's one of those philosophical kind of questions. So I personally lean to option three. I think that we can take staff to draft a sunset policy. You can call it their word if you want.
Shelf law.
What's that? You can call it a redemption policy. You can call it a retirement policy. But let's tackle the first step of the equation. And you raised the correct issue. Do we have the legal right to do that? And the answer is probably no, unless we change the rule. That in and of itself will take time as we work through on a modification of Ordinance 8 to get there. So my recommendation would be to go with item number 3, direct staff to come back to the September board with a policy that tackles those credits that are deemed as retirable. Mike raised the issue of having some provision put in there, similar to what we do when we ship PTP water, and that'll raise a whole bunch of flags for the folks at Kiegas, and I mean at Pleasant Valley, but you ought to have that in there. And it seems to me that we work a lot better in some of these issues if we just force staff to put out on the floor, here's a proposal, and then we beat that proposal up. And out of that, I'm hoping some other discussions will come out of that, and your board side will be on the board and not on individual staff members. And maybe we can accomplish a couple things. Charlotte, we can move this ball down the court a little bit faster. We can figure out what we have to do to change the legislative issue. We can tackle some of the short-term credit issues, give you guys time to come up with a policy that works, because you're making great headway. And if that policy lays the foundation for a allocation methodology, then we can debate that one. And if out of that we reincorporate Robert's suggestions and modify it, we'll get this thing done. But I think that's kind of where I'm leading in option 3. Yes, ma'am.
I want to throw something out. I mean, we got one elephant in the room. Why not two? And this is probably heresy, but who was it? P.T. Barnum, who said if you throw out something that makes everybody mad, it can't be bad. We had a lot of analogies to banking here a little while ago. And part of the things that some countries have had is their currency has gotten way too much inflation. In other words, they had a whole lot more stuff out there than they had money to back it up. And you have said we've got a whole lot more credits than we ever would have water. At some point, and I'm not talking about in this, but I think people need to keep in mind that at some point we may need to just deflate them. You know, I think that might be a way of getting things down to a manageable thing. And as I said, that's heresy, because the cities are all putting all their credits in as, you know, if we have problems in their water plans, we've got this many credits. That's implying we can go and cash those credits in. If we don't have water, it's a false assumption in their water plans. And well,
I think
so. It's just something to keep. Yeah.
I think the best way in the past that we've been able to move forward is and we've used multiple techniques over the years to try to move this ball down the road. In this particular case, I think the technique that we've used or should apply at this point is direct staff to come back with a redemption policy. Put Mike's suggestion in it, put the suggestions that we heard today, some way to quantify it. You have to include in that policy the legalese issues of how we get it through the voting process to make it part of the ordinance, so we have the authority to do this. In the meantime, I'm hearing good things going on in the Los Pozos Basin. We need to keep that going on. At some point, the Oxnard Plain Users Group will meet again. I recognize that there are some very good credits on the books that we need to protect. Kiegas' credits we need to protect. Oxnard's credits we need to protect. There's certain growers' credits that we need to protect to make sure that they're drought-proof in the case we have to go through that exercise, get back to the original intent. But all the other credits on the outside of that, the credits that are used as part of the in-lieu programs and some of the other M&I programs, we built that into the ordinance, the ability to make those kinds of adjustments. We need to get it back to the basics. If we can then demonstrate that the credits we have on the books actually accomplish real water issues and serve real water needs, they will not be used as footballs by some of the folks in Sacramento and Washington and others that believe it's basically an indictment on why we ought to be sending 30,000 acres down to the ocean for the fish because we're flush in water. That is not a true statement. And that's how we tackle the perception. Once we get the credits in a point where we can quantify them and say, this is for Oxnard, this is for Kiegas, this is for the growers, this is for the in-lieu program, these all do functional things and they're all good, all the excess credits are gone, and therefore you folks that want to run all this water down to the ocean, it just doesn't exist. And that's how we ultimately will change that perception, because it's reality. And I think that can be incorporated under task number 3. And my recommendation then would be to bring that back in September, and it gives us some ability to answer some of the questions that maybe the state is raising as part of their ongoing process. Yeah?
I heard some talk about exploring the allocation. Probably does that to be part of this?
Well, here's my take on that. My take on that is, we could say, let's convene a giant allocation SAG group. But the truth of the matter is, it's really going on right now in Las Posas. And maybe we ought to, rather than diverting staff time on that issue, maybe we ought to make sure that that issue is moved down the road, because we have a hook in that whole process. And that hook in the process is we have Emergency Ordinance D. And we've extended it several times, and Al has advised us we can't keep doing this and not show progress. So my feeling is, let's take that area and let's get that area solved and let's get that model in place. And if we can piggyback on that model, we've accomplished the same thing and not diverted staff time. Because we do have a clock ticking on that, and we got to hold ourselves to the fire on that, because I think Al is going to eventually blow a cork over here and not let us do what we want to do. And we're going to have to listen to him when he says no. And I don't want to get to that point yet. Okay? Does that make sense for everybody? Does that make sense for everybody? Mike?
Sorry, I want a little more clarification too. Okay, we're dealing with the credits, but at what point do we come back and are we dealing with the real issue? We're still 30,000 acres. So we lower all the credit issues and we say, look, that's a good reserve. Don't challenge us on this. But the issue is we're still 30,000 acre feet in overdraft. How do we get back to that and not take 2 years to get to it?
Okay, my answer to that is that I don't see, we could do this if everybody wants. We could reconstitute the group. You get to lead it. Reconstitute the group. Folks, there's a movie out there where the lead line is, what we have here is failure to communicate. We could constitute a SAG group to deal with allocation. We could do that. That eats up a lot of staff time. Or we could allow the Oxnard user group, OPEC, to continue doing what they're doing, which is really tackling a allocation issue when you really boil it down, and the Las Posas Basin users group, which is far advanced of anything we're doing right now. And my recommendation is to encourage them to move swiftly and get a policy in place. And if we can use that policy at dealing with the allocation policy for all of us, then we're right where we want to be. So, yes, sir.
Then Chairman Mulhart, given that, why not go with option number 1, which is essentially a status quo option, no further action until you get that information?
Because I've heard from folks that, and I was not aware of this, that in some of these meetings they agreed that there's probably some adjustments we can make to credits. So let's go through the process of pulling at least those off the books and doing the legislative changes we need to have the authority to make adjustments to credits.
Well, I can see that with respect to those credits that aren't being used, should be retired. Yes, that's clear. But I think option number 1 melds much better with what you just said than any of the other 2 options, and they take you to places where you kind of know your end result, at least with the status quo and waiting to get some positive input as to what is working for other folk. That makes sense to me. Option 2 and 3 seem to eat up staff time. You know what the end result is going to be. You know that it doesn't really lead anywhere. At least what you're suggesting now, waiting to get some feedback from these other groups.
Well, potential. I guess it's semantics. Because even if I took status quo number 1, I've got to give staff the direction to come back in September with how to get them off the books, which is staff action. So,
or to wait until status quo and tell staff to wait until they get the information from these other groups and consolidate it and put it in the form of recommendations.
Are you representing somebody who has an inactive account and
Pleasant Valley County
wants to keep their credits and hasn't used their well for a long time?
No.
Okay. All right. Yes, sir.
I'm trying to start Rob's
Rob said I could volunteer, Rob Saperstein said I could volunteer him to co-facilitate the SAG with me, so I don't take the meeting if you would like to send it back. But I wouldn't support status quo. We've been doing that. We can't keep doing it. We got to keep moving. But I'd be glad to do it as long as I've got an attorney covering my back.
All right, hold on, let me, because Charlotte's got to leave. I recommended number 3 with the reasons I've outlined. Anybody object to number 3?
No.
Okay, that's the direction of staff, okay? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Very good, great discussion. Let's, with 1 minute, we have item number 6 before Charlotte tippy-toes out the door.
Chair Mulhart.
Is this something, let me back up. It's a late in the day. Is this something we have to deal with today, Jeff?
It is.
Okay.
It's relatively straightforward.
Okay. Anybody have any problems with it?
Move the action as recommended in the packet.
Motion and a second. Since it's dollars, let's do a vote on it.
Chair Mulhart?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director Kelly?
Yes.
Director Schwabauer?
Yes.
Okay, we're at executive officer's report. Jeff?
Only the 2 pieces of correspondence that you should each have. We received them after the agenda was published. You've heard from the City of Camarillo. We'll take care of the State Water Resources Control Board report back to you in September.
Okay, anybody in the audience before I, yes.
I just have one thing I want to say. I really appreciate Rob coming up and talking about good credits. And he said having credit problem is good. And I just want to emphasize that there are good credits out there, depending on how they're earned, but that doesn't necessarily mean all the credits are good. And particularly when you combine those 2 charts, and you see credits growing and pumping, and you put the 2 together, and we're way over safe yield, some of those credits can't be good credits in that kind of environment.
But that all becomes irrelevant if we have a cap.
Sure, exactly.
That may be the solution.
You can have a wheelbarrow of Confederate money,
Yeah.
and if you can't spend it, you can't spend it.
You're right.
All right, anybody, very good. Anybody else? Okay, and Neil, we got you down on the list as attending, okay? Thank you very much. All right, meeting's adjourned until September 28th, or call the chair, and it's not going to happen.